countdown to the last comic shop in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey, it is now time for more of the Last Comic Shop Podcast!
All right, we don't have time for this. We have an interview with DeMatteis today. We need to get as much of that interview as possible. Andy's here, Mikey's here, Jay Scott is here, I'm here, I'm Chad Smith. Let's just go to the interview.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get DeMatteis on the phone. That's what you tuned in for. Not to hear us talk, but to hear DeMatteis talk. So let's get him on the horn now. That's right. Are you going to ask about Silver Surfer, J.A.?
Yeah, that was all.
That's
his run on Silver Surfer was all. I'm going to deconstruct Silver Surfer. I'm going to strip him of everything that makes him a person, and then rebuild it because that's interesting to me. And make him hook up with Alicia Masters because she doesn't have Thing. She's a kinky little bit. That woman. She like goes from a big rock.
Don't forget about the hot ones period. With Johnny Storm.
Yeah.
All right, and we are here with DeMatteis. You get the Kermit the Frog treatment. That's how we roll here on the Last Comic Shop Podcast. Thank you so much, sir, for being on our show this week. Again, we are massive, massive fans of you and have been for decades. So before I even say anything, thank you for countless hours of quality entertainment over the years. You're a magnificent writer, a comic book legend, and we are so happy to have you for a full hour. So
this is that gratitude thing is super important for me. And I know you've been writing comic books since the 1970s, but in the late 80s, early 90s, your books were some of the first books I pulled off the shelf. So Justice League International, I picked up I think it was an issue in the 30s. Going into the early 90s when everybody else was all about the Image books, and I was too. I kept going back to your work with Sal Buscema, and I'm like, I don't know if I like this, but I kept reading these stories like, these are the best ones. Why are these the best ones? And I didn't understand, the craft involved with you and Sal. And but just some of the books that you are involved in over the years have been some of my favorite comic books, and I've been reading comic books ever since. And so I have you to blame for that. But thank you, sir.
I'll take the credit and the blame for that. Okay, that's okay. I like that. And thank you.
All right, so let's get this kicked off. What got you originally into comics? Did you have a comic at home that you started reading, or what put you on the path to writing for this medium, and then the history that comes that we're going to cover?
I people have asked me that, and I've racked my brain because I do not remember a first comic book. I remember comic books just always kind of being there. I grew up in an era where it was the local candy store. I grew up in Brooklyn. You'd walk a couple of blocks, there'd be an old Jewish man behind the counter making egg creams, and they'd have magazines and newspapers, and then a whole giant rack of comics, and they were just always around. And in that era, kids my age, everyone read comics. It wasn't like it is now where it's this little specialty thing. But I think even before that, growing up in New York, the New York Daily News had a comics section, giant fold-out comics section, big, bright, called Dick Tracy and Little Orphan Annie, and all these things that were in there. So I think that was probably my first contact with that magical combination of words and pictures. I think some of us have a specific chemical in our brains, and when we see that combination of words and pictures, this chemical goes bloop, and it drops in our brain, and that's it, and we are hooked for life, which is much better than being hooked on heroin. So you're going to have an addiction. It's a good one to have, but because there are lots of people that not only do they not respond to that combination of words and pictures, if they look at a comic book, they don't even understand how to read it. And I understand because I grew up with a lot of learning disabilities. So there's a lot of things that I can't read a map the way other people can read a map. My brain just explodes. And I think a lot of people have that same interaction with a comic book page. But for those of us that thing clicks for, in my experience, it just clicked when I was really little, and it hasn't stopped unclicking ever since, Wow. That chemical just keeps dropping.
And I will say that being a less expensive habit than, say, I don't know if comic
hard
books
drugs
in the end is saving you any money, because again, when you
these days,
also that collector's mentality where it's just you look at the covers and you're just like, oh gosh, I got to have that one. That one's shiny. That one's pretty. It really does.
Yeah. You talk about it being an expensive habit, but when I was a kid, it wasn't an expensive habit. But I remember I must have been 6 or 7 when comics were still 10 cents. And they went from 10 cents to 12 cents. And I was in our local candy store with my mother, and she was talking to the lady who owned the candy store, and they were horrified. And the quote was out of my mother's mouth, like with this kind of disgust, 12 cents for a comic book? Like it was just the most disgusting thing she'd ever heard. How could they possibly charge 12 cents for this thing? It was a 2-cent price increase, but I guess it had been 10 cents forever, and they did not
I can empathize, because when they went from $1, 75 cents to $1, and then $1 to $1.25, suddenly you couldn't get 5 comic books for a 5.
Right. Yeah. Well, I had a friend when they were still 10 cents, and he had to go in the hospital to get a mole removed or some little thing like that. And his mother gave him $1. And we went to the candy store, and he got 10 comics. And I was just seething with jealousy. You know what I mean? He got 10 comics at one time. 10 comics at one time now, that might be your rent for the month. I don't know.
Now they sell facsimiles of those 10-cent comics for $7.
Right.
Take me on the journey then from comic book fan spending 10 cents and then 12 cents to
and then 15 cents and then 25 cents.
and then actually thinking, okay, this is something I want to do for a living. How did that come about, and how did you dive into the world?
Well, I was always creative. I spent a good part of my childhood on the floor drawing. My first love was actually art. I was drawing all the time when I was a kid. And I remember I would take a comic book and then get my piece of paper and my crayons and try to recreate that freehand, And I still have memories of those sort of square-jawed Bob Kane, quote, put Bob Kane in quote, Batman figures in, and sitting there trying to really capture that look. So creativity was always my thing. So I loved to draw. I was good at writing. I was in the 5th grade when the Beatles popped up on the Ed Sullivan Show, and that was it for me. And I got a guitar, and I started playing guitar, and I played in bands, and I write songs, and I sing. So creativity is my thing. I am not good at much of anything else. To be perfectly honest, thank God that I was able to make it in a creative field, because otherwise you might see me, walking down the street pushing a shopping cart filled with all my belongings, because anytime I attempted to even set foot into the 9-to-5 world, it was just a disaster. It was just, I wasn't made for it, So I consider myself very lucky that I've been able to do what I do. I always loved comics, so that was something that always called me. But the goal was never like, I want to just be a comic book writer or a comic book artist. I just wanted to be creative, and comics was one of my passions. So I'm playing in bands, I'm doing all that stuff. Along the way, I also became, I did a lot of rock and roll journalism, reviewing concerts, reviewing albums, all that stuff. When I was like 18, I made an attempt. I had never seen a comic book script in my life. I wrote up some samples. I don't even remember what it was, and I sent it into Marvel. Just blind, Okay. And I got back a letter from a writer who later went on to become very well known at Marvel, but he must have been having a bad day because he was not very nice. Now, I can guarantee that what I sent wasn't good. Guaranteed. Okay. But the response was so negative and dismissive, with not even an ounce of come back in a few years, practice your craft and try again. It was like, get lost,
Wow.
But I look back and I must think, you don't know what's going on in that person's life on that given day. So I just could have hit him on the worst day possible. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
Maybe it was a reverse psychology thing, because obviously the plan worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Maybe it galvanized you to be
That's something we can talk about, because it's really important how you deal with rejection. Yeah. So a year later, I read that DC they're doing an apprenticeship program. This is like in the early 70s. If you get accepted, you get trained to be a comic book writer. Well, how cool is that? So I'm going to write up a script and send it to them. I decide, like an idiot, I'm going to write a Justice League script. Team books are the hardest thing in the world to write. I've been doing this for years, and there's still team books are really, you have to get so many different elements right in a team book. You're juggling so many characters, so many emotions, so many powers. It's just, so I write, and I don't remember what it was about either. I write this Justice League script. I send it in. I did not get into the program, understandably, but I got a really nice, encouraging letter back. Plus, I learned what the format was. So that was the next step. And again, meanwhile, I'm continuing on playing music. I'm writing short stories and sending them out to magazines and getting stacks of rejection letters that I still have a bunch of them in my desk drawer over there. But you get a relationship with an editor of a magazine who sees the value in your work, gives you positive feedback. And that's all I ever needed. All I ever needed, because this is who I am. I am a creative being, and that's all I wanted to do. So the smallest crumb of encouragement, even if 3/4 of it was, this story's not working, we're not going to buy it, we don't like this or that. But if there was something positive in there, that's what I always held on to. And I took in the criticism and tried to apply it to the next thing I did. So somewhere around maybe 1977, I decided I'm going to try again with DC. Wrote up a bunch of samples. There was a Superman story in there. I had an original thing, which was sort of the early seeds of what became Moonshadow. He said, we're not going to buy a Superman story from some new writer we've never heard of, but Paul Levitz is buying stories for what they used to call the mystery books, because they couldn't use the word horror in those days because of the code, I've been reading comics my whole life. I never even knew that these books existed. House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Weird War Tales. So I went out and I bought a bunch of those books, and I got what it was. They're little like 5 to 8 page twist ending, almost Twilight Zone-y / horror stories. Wrote up a bunch of ideas, sent them into Paul, and I still have the letter. And I think I posted it online at one point. Paul basically shredded my stories, shredded them, rightfully so. Again, rightfully so. But he said, please feel free to submit again. So the way it looked to my eyes was, here's like this little thing at the top where he's tearing my stories to pieces. And then in giant letters, please feel free to submit again. That's all I needed. And looking back, why did he even say that? I give Paul, no, seriously, I give him so much credit, A, for reading stuff out of the slush pile, and giving me criticism and then inviting me to submit again. I mean, I have so much affection for Paul just for the way he opened the door on my career for me. So I would start to send him more ideas, and he would tell me what was wrong with them and why he wasn't buying them. And because I lived in Brooklyn and DC was in Manhattan, I said, hey, can I come into the office and pitch you some ideas? So he said, sure. So we made an appointment. I went up to DC. I meet Paul, who turns out is younger than me. The guy could barely grow a mustache. He'd been working at DC since he was 16 in high school. But Paul always had the aura of like a 50-year-old man. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he's so smart and so skilled. And we sat there and I pitch him ideas, and he likes one idea. And we start talking about the idea, and he takes out a piece of paper and, well, you can do this. And when you're doing a script, this is what you have, break it down this way, daughter. And I still have this piece of paper also. And I realize he wants me to go home and write this thing. And I'm like, so I go home, I write the script, I go back, he tells me what's wrong with it, I go back, I rewrite the script, I bring it in, he reads it, shakes my hand and says, welcome to the business.
Wow. So you eventually did get into the DC apprenticeship program, because honestly, that's kind of sort of what he did there. He was like, here's your critiques. Even better. Go back, work on this, bring it back. Eventually, I'm going to get this thing published. I'm just walking you through. But the important thing is that I stress to people that want to work in the creative arts is this. The minute I got that first letter from Paul, I could have seen him tear my stories apart. I would have crawled under my desk and maybe never come out. Yeah. And a lot of people cannot handle rejection. They have very thin skin. You need a thick skin and a hard head, I always tell people. And the most important thing is a fierce will. You have to want it more than anything. I've seen hugely talented people, not just but in all through the arts, who have great talent, but they cannot deal with any kind of criticism. So they run away, and that's it. And I've seen people with not so much talent yet, but that will, and they want it, so they will take it all in, and they will work and they will work and they will work until they get their craft up to the level of where that will is, and they'll break through. I give Paul all the credit in the world, and I give my young self a lot of credit for not running away. I think because I knew this is my one chance. I can't do anything else. I have to make it in the creative arts. No, but really, truly, it was my passion. It's the thing. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. Suddenly tomorrow, no one was buying my work. I'd still be laying on the floor making up stories, and having to write them down or picking up the guitar or whatever it is, because it's just who I am. So I think you need that combination of talent and will and a really hard head, because it's just the nature of the creative life. You are going to constantly, no matter how successful you appear to be to the world, you're always running into brick walls. You're always facing rejection. And you have to, I always say, crawl into your desk, bang your head against the wall, curse the gods, and get up and write another story. Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is these are great words. If you are in the creative arts, make sure that you are continuing to try to do
And you can see that grit throughout the course of your career, because you're not the type of person that writes the same story over and over again. You're constantly experimenting, and you're one of those writers that, one of the reasons I love your work, you're not afraid to go silly and then go serious and hit you up with the drama and the pathos, and like you paint with all the emotions. But those are big risks that a lot of writers never find the courage or conviction to take.
Experimenting and reinventing, because again, you hit some success, and then at some point it's inevitable things are going to slow down. The freelance life is not for everybody. I have had years where I have made probably more money than my parents made in their lifetime, being a working class family from Brooklyn. And then I've had years, not long after those years, where like you're on the edge of losing your house, because there's no work and it all dries up. So you have to just keep going, reinventing. You have to, even if you've been successful, I've seen you have to kind of remind people who you are and what you've done. It's a very weird thing. It's like editors get amnesia, or they're so, suddenly, on Monday, you have all the work in the world and the phone's ringing, you're turning down work, and on Tuesday, maybe there's a new editor in chief or a new publisher or something, and someone up the food chain makes a decision and they don't want to use you anymore for reasons that are baffling.
Yeah.
And as freelancers, we're all sitting alone in our rooms being paranoid, making up crazy reasons why this is happening. And chances are whatever's going on has so little to do with us and more to do with whatever business is going on at the company.
Right.
Which is never fun, but it happens. And, you take a breath, just like I said, you move on, you work on the next story. So you constantly have to say yes. You constantly have to know if you hit a closed door here, immediately turn to the right and open the next door over there. And you have to keep kind of what you're saying, keep as many doors open, work in as many genres as possible. Don't just work in comics. I've worked in prose. I've worked for television, live action, and animation. If you're a creative person, create, because the door will always close at some point. So you better damn well make sure you have another open door somewhere.
Right. Plus the fact that when you're in the creative arts, I mean, sometimes you can put out work, right? You put out work and it sits there maybe, and it can be 5-10 years before somebody comes like, wait a second, wow, like that was actually really, really good. Like, I don't know why nobody was paying attention to it at the time, but then all of a sudden, just boom. So it's like you're planting seeds constantly.
That's happened to me a number of times. When the project comes out, I feel like it just flies under the radar or it crashes into the ground. And then 10 years later, suddenly I'm at a convention and everybody's bringing that run. And, I love that. And this and that, you just never know. You never know. You look at someone like Orson Welles, and I'm not comparing myself to Orson Welles. Let me be clear about that. He did Citizen Kane, right? And then the myth was after Citizen Kane, he did nothing of any value. Well, he made many phenomenal movies, but in his lifetime, got virtually no appreciation for them. He dies, and all these movies that were considered failures were suddenly masterpieces. Mm-hmm. So, you never know. You never know. And I always say, all I can do is write the best story I can write, and then I sail it out into the world, and then it becomes a dance between the audience and the story. I'm out of the picture. It's the audience and the story. And sometimes they click with that story. Sometimes I put out the best story I've ever written, and it doesn't feel like it gets any response. Another story that I think, that one was okay, and everybody loves it, and I don't know why. Yeah. I have no clue. And that's part of the mystery. The creation of the story is a mystery, and then the response it gets in the world is a mystery. So all I can do is just enjoy my work and do the best I can, and the rest is up to the universe,
Well, you mentioned in one of your comments about editors in chiefs, right? So
Mm-hmm.
one of the people that I immediately think of every single time I hear the word editor in chief is Jim Shooter, because I was a Marvel kid. I was a Marvel kid growing up, and Jim Shooter's hand was in everything because I was growing up in the 80s. You kind of did start at Marvel, and he kind of had you doing some odd jobs, and eventually you landed on 2 books that I really do know you for, which is Defenders, and then your run with Mike Zeck on Captain America. So right. I guess, how was it working with Jim Shooter?
Jim was very important in my career. I started at DC, and first working with Paul, then Jack Harris, then the late, great Len Wein, who became my mentor and dear friend, who really was so important in my development as a writer. And Jim finally got to read some of my work. And also, because I was a journalist at the same time, which is always, again, keep all the different doors open, I did some articles about the comic book business. So I got to go up to Marvel and interview Jim and spend a couple hours with him. And, but he liked my work, and he kept throwing me these little opportunities. And I tell the story just because I look back and I still can't quite believe it. One of the gigs he threw me was Marvel was suing a company. There was a cartoon called Web Woman in the late 70s. And I think they were trying to put together a lawsuit because they thought it was a ripoff of Spider-Man. So they said, can you come in and watch these cartoons? So first of all, first part of the job, come into the Marvel office and watch cartoons and write up a document comparing Web Woman and Spider-Man and the similarities. Okay. So we need some place to put you for these 2 weeks or whatever that you're going to be up here. Well, Stan's out of town. We'll put you in Stan's office. Wow. So I got paid to spend 2 weeks in Stan Lee's office watching cartoons.
Good work if you can get it.
You know, it's great work if you can get it.
That's right.
So Jim, I wrote plots for French Spider-Man stories, which a few years ago I finally tracked one down, a page of art on the web. I'd forgotten I'd even done it, and somehow it came up, and they've got the American writers to write plots, and then a French artist would draw it, and a French writer would dialogue it. And so I wrote a bunch of those. So he would throw me those jobs, and got me working on fill-ins. And again, Jim did what Paul and Len and Jack did. As you're working on the project, he's teaching you. Jim knew a lot. He was only maybe 3 years older than me, 4 years at most, and he'd been working he started selling comics when he was 13. He was writing for DC. Astonishing, really, really smart, really, really talented, really understood story. And this is another lesson for people that want to break in, whether it's comics or anything else. My rule was the editor is always right in the beginning, because I wanted to learn. So who am I to come in and tell Jim Shooter or Len Wein, no, I don't want to do it that way. I want to get my foot in the door. I want to learn. I want to be a better writer. I want to understand this craft. So if you tell me to paint every character in the story green or have them all standing on their head, which no one ever said to me, but I'm exaggerating to make a point, I will do that. And I remember Jim saying, you're different than a lot of guys that come in here. You listen to what I say. And I'm thinking, why wouldn't I? I want to work for this company. You're the editor-in-chief and you're smart and know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? Why wouldn't I listen to you? So Jim was very pivotal. And there was a certain point where Jim offered me a contract at Marvel around the same time that Len at DC asked me to come on staff and be his assistant. Okay. So suddenly, from nowhere, I'm getting this incredible choice to go to Marvel or to go to DC. And the decision was made because my son was born around that time. And I knew if I took the freelance contract, I could continue to work at home and be a stay-at-home dad for my son. So that was the thing. It was a tough decision because I loved Len. It was just, I loved him as a person and I loved him as my editor. So I took the Marvel gig. And so Jim opened that door for me, gave me a contract, 3 books a month, and we were off. So I think Jim did a lot of fantastic things for Marvel. He was a really smart guy, taught me a lot. And, here's the truth. Anybody sitting in that chair, any editor-in-chief at any company, anybody with authority, their job is to make decisions. So say I'm the editor-in-chief, I make a decision tomorrow about something in the books. Well, guaranteed 50% of the people are going to think that's the most brilliant decision that was ever made. Mm-hmm. And 50% are going to think I'm the biggest asshole on the face of the planet. And I'm completely wrong.
And it's not a creative decision. That's the other thing. There's a business aspect.
Right. There's business aspect to it. There's so many things that go into that. Right. Exactly. And Jim was a sort of a literally towering, intimidating figure. He didn't always have the best people skills. I think he alienated a lot of people. And I had my issues with him at the end when I left Marvel and went back to DC and whatever. But when I look back and I weigh the pros and cons of my experiences with Jim, the pros far outweigh the cons. And as years have passed and I look back and I see other people in similar positions at other companies and how they handled that job, the thing I always respected about Jim is whether you agreed with it or not, he always had a vision.
Right.
I've seen other people in similar positions who have no vision. And then they're telling you, change this, do that, and you want to really know why. And there really isn't a why except the mood that's happening on that given day. So I always respected Jim's vision. I didn't always agree with it. And we butted heads on occasion, but I have tremendous respect for him. And I'm incredibly grateful for what he did for me in my early days at Marvel.
All right. Well, we're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be back with more of The Last Comic Shop in this fantastic interview. So stay tuned, kids. This is great stuff.
Hi, it's Carlo Calantuan, last comic shop podcast listener and comic book tragic here in the Philippines. Mabuhay! When I'm in the US, I'm always on the lookout for a good deal on boards, bags, boxes, and all other manner of comic book related supplies. And that's why I love to go to bcwsupplies.com and use the promo code LCSPOD to get 10% off of all my orders. Not only do I get a discount on everything I buy at BCW, but I'm able to support the podcast when I use LCSPOD at checkout. So if you're in need of comic book supplies, head over to bcwsupplies.com and use the promo code LCSPOD. Oh, and guys, I'm still waiting for that Tressie review. Come on, when is it?
Lords of the Cosmos is the critically acclaimed indie comic masterpiece that combines the best of He-Man and heavy metal into a sci-fi fantasy hero mashup. Bringing together artists, writers, and creators from across the comics industry, Lords of the Cosmos is about to launch a Kickstarter for their 5th issue. Jam-packed with celebrity artist pinups, dynamic storytelling, and beautiful artwork, this book is a masterclass for anyone who appreciates vintage storytelling in the 80s and 90s style. Catch up on the back issues and join the Lords of the Cosmos for their next great adventure by signing up for the Kickstarter pre-launch at jasonlennox.com.
Hello, world. I'm terrible at this. We're back from the commercials. I hope you buy everything that they talk about there. Anyway, this is Mikey and the Last Comic Shop guys, and we are talking with the incredible J.M. DeMatteis. I always pronounce it wrong.
It was close enough.
And how I first stumbled into your work was I think I was like maybe 13 or 14 years old, and I was in Passaic Book Center in New Jersey, and I'm flipping through the M's looking for copies of Moon Knight, and I stumble across this book called Moonshadow, and there's about 3 issues or so, because it was probably like 86, maybe 85, 86 at the time, 3 or 4.
Came out in 85. Yeah, ran for 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever number of issues, and I saw the title Moonshadow, and I knew the song, the Cat Stevens song, because I am a New Jersey boy who's the son of a hippie and a cop.
Hippie and a cop.
Oh,
wow,
my
nice.
God. Yeah. My mother and father. And,
so did he arrest her and they fell in love?
I don't know. I don't know how it happened. So I see this book Moonshadow, and the first thing and this is the epic Moonshadow.
Right, the original.
And I pick up the book, and the cover is gorgeous, and the interior work is gorgeous, and it's just like something I've never seen before in my life. I'd never seen a painted comic before, and I don't think there had been one.
There hadn't. As far as I know, it was the first painted comic in America. There had been in Europe, clearly, but not in the United States.
Just stunning and strange, and I will admit it, nudity and some other things that really, really interested me at the time. And so
really, it all came down to naked women for you. Is that what it was?
Kind of did, yeah. No, but there's just the imagery of I think the book did what it was supposed to do for me. It was a coming of age book, and then that moved me on to seeing your name on the cover of Blood, a tale with Kent Williams, and I bought all 4 of those issues. And how do you get books that are that personal and that, because eventually, Brooklyn Dreams comes out through Paradox, and in my brain, Brooklyn Dreams is very, at least next door neighboring, maybe possibly cousin to Moonshadow. They work together.
They are mirrors of each other. Yeah, okay. You're absolutely right. Well, Moonshadow came about because, you're talking about the 80s. The 80s was an amazing time in comics. Yeah. It was like someone said, okay, we're taking the shackles off and we will try anything and let the creative people have their head and run and experiment and play. And so I'm sitting and I'm at Marvel and I'm working on, Captain America and Marvel Team Up and Defenders and Ghost Rider and all this stuff and having a great time. But what I realized in retrospect, I had put certain limitations on myself. Part of it is the limitations of the form and the era, but part of it was just me. This is how you do a comic book, and you can't go beyond these parameters. At the same time, everything is personal. If I'm writing Spider-Man, I may not realize it, but in order for the story to work, it has to come from the deepest, most personal parts of yourself. We'll get to that in a minute. So I'm looking around at DC. They're doing Camelot 3000. They're doing Ronin. The Epic Illustrated, the Epic line is starting. And I'm like, I want to move into those waters. And the Moonshadow idea, I said with those first scripts I sent to DC, originally it was called Stardust. And it was very different. It had more of a Kurt Vonnegut sort of tongue-in-cheek cosmic flavor, And so I was pondering, my contract was up at Marvel. I was going to go back to DC. They wanted me to come back. And I talked to my friend Karen Berger about Moonshadow. And she wanted to do Moonshadow at DC. And Dave Gibbons, who doesn't even remember that this happened, I don't know if she ever just said, "Oh, there's this new artist, Dave Gibbons. I'm going to put you together with Dave Gibbons and you'll do Moonshadow." So somewhere there's a parallel universe where Dave Gibbons and I did Moonshadow.
Interesting.
The other funny thing that happened at DC was that Marty Pasco had left Swamp Thing, and Len wanted me to come and write Swamp Thing. For a long story short, I decided to go back to stay with Marvel. So he got this obscure writer Alan Moore to come in and do Swamp Thing after that. You know, so all these little turns of the cosmic wheel and all these parallel universes get created. So I go back, you know, and in part of my negotiation with Jim to come back to Marvel, I said, I have this thing I want to do, Moonshadow. And he reads it. He says, well, that's an epic comic. Go talk to Archie Goodwin, who was one of the smartest, nicest people in the business. Just a great guy. The whole epic crowd, Laurie Sutton and Margaret Clark and Dan Chichester, they were all working at Epic at the time. But they were just great people. And so through my friend Dan Green, I met John J. Muth, who had been doing some work for Epic Illustrated. And he was, if he was 22 at the time, maybe. And he's just already fully formed, this extraordinary artist. And so Dan had given him the outline and we sat and we talked. And he shows up at my house one day with all these sketches, and they're very Dickensian, you know? I said, oh, this is what you're doing. It looks like it's out of a Dickens novel. He said, well, that's what you wrote, isn't it? And like, he saw it more clearly than I did, but it was. What I was writing was this very Dickensian story. The beauty of working with Muth was he was so good that he challenged me to up my game. And then when I would up my game, he would up his game. And it was just like, you can't work with somebody that good and not up your game. The other great thing about Moonshadow was I stepped outside of the limitations, whether they were self-imposed or imposed from without, of the Marvel DC universes. And I just wrote that story as if I was writing a novel. I wasn't thinking I'm writing a comic book. I'm just telling this story. And it was one of those stories where it just led me on. I expanded so much as a writer, as a creative being, probably as a person, by writing that book. It freed me in a way that nothing I'd ever written before freed me. It remains one of my favorite things that I ever did.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Dickens thing, because my wife is familiar with Muth's work from his sort of his children's books. Is more kind of
he was very successful in that field. Yeah,
his Zen.
Yes,
books. And so I said, oh my God, he did Moonshadow, but the best way to describe it was Nicholas Nickleby and Little Nemo sort of mixed together and put out there. It's like this coming of age growth thing. And
it's funny. I used to call it David Copperfield meets Siddhartha in space.
Yeah. There was just such a vibe to it. And then in '97, when Vertigo reprinted it, thank God for Vertigo, and the final chapter came out. What a hard-hitting final, beautiful, happy, wonderful ending for this character that had been through so much terrible stuff. You know, just like you always recognize a story that you wrote even in the mainstream superhero comics, because there's a bit more metaphysics involved than usually are. And is that something that you've just kind of always been interested in, and you've always been? I
was just talking to somebody recently. They said, well, what are the themes in your work? You know, and the themes are always, if you really dig through it, whether it's on a personal level, a psychological level, a spiritual level, a cosmic level, it comes down to, who am I? What is this all about? How does this all work? Those are the questions that have obsessed me since I was a teenager. And those are the themes that run through all my work. So in some stories, it might be purely psychological. In others, it might be in the broader spiritual, cosmic, metaphysical realm. But I think, you know, if we're on this planet, it all comes down to, in the end, who am I? Why am I here? What the hell is this all about? And sometimes that means we're exploring our psychological roots with our family and our trauma and all that. And sometimes it's like, wait a minute, no, forget that. Why am I here? And why does the universe exist? So these are the questions that fascinate me. When I went from Moonshadow to Kraven's Last Hunt, in a way, Kraven's Last Hunt is as personal to me as Moonshadow. I didn't realize it at the time. It's all metaphorical, but it was all about what my life was at that time and what I was going through. Using those characters as metaphors for my own psychological morass that I was living in at the moment, you know?
There you go. You've made it to a certain point, and what do you do from there? Like, how do you carry on?
You really do. You have to bleed into any story. Any story. You have to make it deeply, deeply personal. And that's just my nature. It's just the way I operate. Find a writer, look at their body of work, and if they think all they're doing is like making little cuckoo clocks of plots, you'll read their body of work and you will find all the keys to their personality and their lives hidden in that work.
Probably. There's a thesis in there. Well, you know, on a personal level, before I let somebody else talk, because I could go on forever. Honestly, I could. Moonshadow in particular, I appreciate that so very much. And when they said that they were interviewing, they just casually said, I literally jumped in and said, I have to be there, if only to do that one fanboy thing, and then I'll shut up. But that was very, very important book to me, Moonshadow, and even Blood in a way,
Blood, I think found its way. The people I found an interesting reaction to Blood. There were two reactions, and there was always just one of those two reactions. Either it was like, "What the hell is this?" or they totally got it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I understand both reactions. I don't know if I, as a reader, how I would have reacted to that story as a reader, but as a creative person working with Kent, we had such a good time. We were just playing with different story forms, and expanding the parameters of what we could do within a comic book story. But I understand the people that didn't like it, and I totally get the people that loved it. And both reactions are very valid.
Yeah. I started as the former and became the latter. Like, I'd never seen art like that before. Moonshadow was painterly, but Blood was dark and muddy and strange, and it really pulled me in. And after reading it, and again, the whole point of that book is, who am I? That whole
is
just fabulous book. But anyway,
just to throw in a few plugs, we are working on getting Blood back in print again, and hopefully by next year it will come out. Dark Horse a few years ago did a beautiful hardcover of Moonshadow, which is the best collection ever, with all kinds of extras that I found that we put in the back. We're going to have a trade paperback version of that coming out next year, and a new edition of Brooklyn Dreams from Dark Horse next year also.
Oh, awesome. Very, very nice.
Yeah.
Will we ever get a spectacular Spider-Man?
Yeah, we could spend a whole...
I have collections. I have a spectacular Spider-Man omnibus from Poland. Ooh. I have collections from Italy, from South America, all over the world, and it has not happened here yet. I think it will. I think it will happen sooner than later.
We're still waiting with bated breath. Well, that's it. So you are obviously a great collaborator, and I'm curious about how your collaborations in comics are different when you're working with somebody like Sal versus the JLI, where you're working with Keith Giffen, as well as Kevin McGuire, or later Adam Hughes and all that stuff. What is your process like in those different scenarios? How does it change with the different folks you're working with, whether, like I said, Sal or Mike Zeck or Keith Giffen? And
well, with Keith, it's a whole other universe of stuff. And the way we worked is only the way that I only worked with Keith and nobody else, because we were co-writing. It was a whole different thing. I could talk for an hour.
Yeah. Did styles bleed? Because again, all
right, let's talk about Keith. I still, when you say the late great Keith Giffen, I still can't really wrap my head around it. It's just, I used to joke with Keith because he had a lot of health problems over the years. But I said, Keith, this world is going to be like a burned out apocalyptic cinder. Everyone's going to be dead, but you'll be sitting on a rock somewhere smoking a cigarette. I thought he would outlive everybody. So it's still upsetting thinking that he's not here. So how did we work? Well, we were thrown together by the genius of Andy Helfer on Justice League, working in this way that I had never worked before, because Keith originally wanted to write the book, and then he didn't have the confidence to basically take it to the final step of, actually doing the script. So he would plot the book, but he plotted them by drawing little mini comics. Kind of like what you've ever seen, Kirby's, Kirby did full pencils, but, would Kirby put the notes in the margins and right. That would give Stan the key to what was going on. So
like a Marvel method, sort of.
So Keith would do a little mini comic with his notes in the margins. But the great thing about our collaboration was I was totally free to do whatever I wanted with that. And as the months passed, I realized that I had that freedom. And what I learned, and what the people that like to put Stan Lee down don't understand, is you can do so much just in the scripting stage. You can completely change the story in the scripting stage. You can deepen and develop the characters. You can add a whole subplot, all through the scripting stage. And Keith had no creative ego. So here's Keith. He's as close to a genius as I've ever worked with in this business, creating these rock solid plots that if I just followed exactly what he wanted, it would have been great. But I was free to go and play. And he loved it. And he would take what I did and he would build on that. And then I'd see what he would do and I would build on that. And even, as more of the years passed, because we continued to work together for 30 years, from Justice League straight through to Scooby Apocalypse. And even when we were talking about the plots and collaborating on the plots, he would go off and just do whatever the hell he wanted. We could say on Monday, we're going to do this, and then the plot comes and it's something else. And so he was free to do what he wanted. I was free to do what I wanted. And we respected each other. We loved working together. There was so much, but as years passed, all I had to do was like glance at a page of Keith's plot and I knew what to do. And it was like a mind meld, it reached a point where I could write a Giff and DeMatteis story myself if I needed to, because Keith was living in my head. And I think I was living in his head to a certain degree.
You had him on the one shoulder and your personality.
So even if he wasn't involved, I could still do it, because I learned from him. I hope he learned from me, and we just mind melded, and it was one of the great collaborations of my career.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and the work you guys produced all throughout, I can't believe it's not the Justice League, formerly known as Justice League, and then you went on and did...
I know, after he passed, I sat down, I looked at all the stuff we'd done together over the years. We worked on a lot of projects together over the years, and I have to give credit where credit's due. Let's bring in Kevin Maguire into this discussion, because Kevin was the right artist at the right time. Nobody can do acting on the comic book page like Kevin does, and we had a very character-centric... We could be serious, but a lot of joking in there, and Kevin sold that 1,000%. And I always say, to give credit where credit's due, possibly if someone else had been drawing that book, we wouldn't be talking about it today. Yeah, a lot of other artists came after, but Kevin created the visual template for that book and did it brilliantly.
So I have one question in regards to that collaboration. Whose idea was the punch? Like, whose idea was it? Like, did Keith?
That was in the plot. Yeah. The one punch was in the plot, and then all I had to do was play with it in the dialogue, and then Kevin drew it brilliantly. Mm-hmm. And does anybody in their right mind think that they're doing this one panel in some random comic book that 30, 40, whatever it is, 35 years later, people are going to still be talking about it?
Yeah, I mean, they even call it the Bwah-Ha-Ha era.
Yeah. Oh, Keith and I used to argue all the time about who came up with Bwah-Ha-Ha. I swore that it was that I saw it once in one of his plots, and I thought that was hysterical. And I used to joke that my job at working with Keith was to take one good idea of his and then repeat it 1,000 times and beat it into the ground. But he thought that I came up with the Bwah-Ha-Ha, and then he liked it, and we didn't want to know. We didn't want to really. In the end, it didn't matter who came up with it. It was the mind meld, exactly.
It's probably, for me, it's the best run of a team book that I've ever read. And Amazon tells me the third omnibus is going to be here by Tuesday. But that book was just a joy. And then when you brought that sensibility over to the Defenders, to Marvel, that the whole team moved over to what a joyful, silly, wonderful book that was.
Yes.
And we need more of that. I think at the time, everything was so... that whole dark and gritty, quote unquote, that they did because of, wonderful books that made things a little darker, but it was such a kind of a bright light in the midst of people getting, lots of...
Yeah, well, I look back and I realized that I was writing Kraven's Last Hunt and Justice League at the same time. They overlapped.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Which is interesting because they're so different.
Yeah. It's, again, we talk about seeds, right? This certain seeds, certain well springs pop up, and then all of a sudden it just branches out, and you can see so many other creators and artists just be impacted.
And let me be clear, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. People are like, what was your vision for let's do a sitcom comic book? No, Keith happened to have a sense of humor, and so his humor bled into the book. I built on the humor that he had in there. No one sat down and go, let's do a funny superhero comic. No. In fact, if you look at the earlier issues, they're a lot more serious, and the humor just kind of bleeds through because the characters lead you. And, so when did you decide that Beetle and Booster were going to be blah, blah, blah? No, we didn't decide anything. Beetle and Booster decided. You put two characters together, they start talking to each other, there's chemistry, and off you go. So, and the truth of the matter is, and I've said this before, even while we were doing it, the book was a great success. I mean, we were like almost a sub imprint of DC for a while with Justice League Unlimited, Justice League Europe. I was doing all these spin-offs with Mr. Miracle and Dr. Fate and all these other things, But then the gig was over, and we're like, okay, gig's over, move on. And then 10 years later, we come back together for I Can't Believe It's Not the Justice League. And that, believe it or not, it wasn't until we did that the three of us went, oh, that's pretty good what we do together. Because when we were doing it, it was just a gig. It was a fun gig, but it was just a gig. And then suddenly we went, oh, this is good. We need to keep doing this. Yeah. And, we worked with Kevin Moore, and Keith and I worked on, like I said, so many other projects together. So, but we didn't know it was anything special because you can't know that it's anyone. If someone sits down and go, I'm going to create a project now that will live for decades, that's the first sign of failure, right? You just do your job, do the best you can. And as we said before, sometimes the best work you ever do, no one will notice, or they might notice it for 20 years. And then something like Justice League or Kraven's Last Hunt comes along and it connects with an audience in a way that has nothing to do with us. It just, whatever it was, it hit at the right time and people responded to it. And it's a nice thing to know that all these years later, I can go to a convention and some guy walks up to me and says, I just read this for the first time last week. Yeah. Wow, that's what you want. How great is that? And here, the third omnibus is out. How wonderful is that? And they basically covered everything, including all the little reunion series that we did, So it's really nice to have all this stuff collected and have it out there and people still discovering it. I remain very grateful for that.
I still think that Justice League sitcom had legs. I like the pilot. I'm the only person who liked it. Did you ever see that, the live action pilot?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
I think if they had better costumes, it would have gone further.
There was also talk when I wrote a bunch of episodes of Batman the Brave and the Bold. And some of them included the JLI. And there was talk as Brave and the Bold was winding down that they were going to spin off a JLI animated show out of that. And I think someone up the food chain said no, and that was the end of that. But that would have been great.
An alternate universe where we would have gotten that.
Well, James Gunn is a big JLI fan, so who knows what will come, So there you
crossed.
go.
All right, well, we've got to take one more last commercial break, and we'll be back with more of this wonderful interview right after this, so stay tuned.
You know what I think? This world we're in right now is the fairy tale. And what's really real is on the other side.
Ramsey, mechanic by day, aspiring comic book creator by night, went into the woods and tripped. He was bombarded by bizarre and mysterious glyphs that he drew into his sketch pad and onto the body of his muse, Regina.
Oh, groovy! Your art is crawling all over me.
Shit. What is going on with you?
What's going on with you? All of a sudden, you're a complete drip, baby. Maybe you need another limb to the head. Ah!
Bloom, written and created by Ted Sikora, with art by Butch Mappa.
How are you feeling, Ram Man?
You've never experienced a story so astonishing, so far out and away from the beaten path.
Where in the am I?
Blast off with Bloom, the origin of a prophet. Order yours at herotomorrow.com.
All right, we're back with more of The Last Comic Shop. And again, we're talking with J.M. DeMatteis. I hope I'm pronouncing that.
You are.
Great. Thank you, sir.
We've been reading it wrong for 30 years.
Well, here's the thing. It's just so you know. The Italian pronunciation is DeMatteis. The family came to America and it got squashed into DeMatteis, right? So I accept DeMatteis, but my father always used to say, it's really pronounced DeMatteis. And when my daughter was 10 or 12, I said this to her, and she was like, well, then why don't we say it that way? If that's what it really is. And I went, you're right. So that's when I went from DeMatteis to DeMatteis again, And then when I went to Italy and I went to Calabria, to the town where my grandparents came from, and they pronounced it DeMatteis with no is, just a straight, DeMatteis. And I said, I can't change it again. It's enough. but it's not DeMatteis. It's not DeMatteis. None of that stuff. Right. I used to ask Keith, because Keith used to mispronounce my last name. So if Keith was doing it, everyone else has an excuse.
Okay. Well, we wanted to finish up today's program talking about Spectacular Spider-Man because it's, again, one of the main reasons Chad and I wanted to have you on this week's show. Because, again, at the time in which, boy, there was so much stuff going on at Amazing Spider-Man with, like, the art, the Todd McFarlane, the Mark Bagley, the Eric Larson, and everybody was obsessed with the art. You had Spectacular Spider-Man, and it started with Child Within, the story in which you brought back Vermin from Kraven's Last Hunt, from your Captain America run with Mike Zeck.
And Marvel team up.
You started pulling at the relationship between Peter and Harry, which was, again, something that had been in the background for years. Again, as far back as Norman Osborn passing away. You brought back Harry to the forefront. Oh, gosh. Those next issues leading up to 200. some of the best Spider-Man ever written. And Chad and I are huge Spider-Man fans. We've read it all. Still, some of the best Spider-Man ever written. And so you've got Sal with his haymaker punches and, always head over heels, spittle coming out of the side of the mouth. What was it like writing Spectacular Spider-Man at that time? Did you know you were writing something that great, or were you just like, I'm just writing this as a gig?
Well, first, let me just say, you don't know how many times to this day in a script or a plot, I'll write a Sal Buscema punch specifically. So the artist knows exactly what I'm going for,
Universal language.
It is, It's never just a gig. It can't be just a gig. On the one hand, when I said like Justice League was just a gig, meaning that when it was over, we moved on. But while you're doing the work, it has to be meaningful to you, And, I'd already had a history with Spider-Man, 3 years on Marvel Team Up and Kraven's Last Hunt. And so I knew that character. I loved that character. And, I was talking earlier about how the characters have to become real to you. Well, I know, as I've said before, I know Peter Parker better than I know my best friend, because I know every thought in Peter's head when I'm writing him. You know what I mean? He's real to me. Ben Reilly is real to me. Aunt May is real to me. I believe in these characters. So I was really delighted to be working on Spider-Man again. I was working with Danny Fingeroth, was my editor, one of my oldest, best buddies in the business, and a wonderful editor. And then Sal. So in writer-artist relationships, just as there is in human relationships, there's either chemistry or there's not. You meet somebody, you hit it off instantly. You meet somebody else and they might be the nicest person on earth, and every conversation is awkward because you just can't connect. There's something missing there. Same thing with writers and artists. You may never have to meet that person in person even. It happens on the page. And with Sal, from the first page, from the first panel, something just clicked. And it's another one of those things where, we worked plot first, but my plots were very tight. So if you see a 9-panel page, where it's like 8 panels of Harry's face not moving, in the 9th panel he smiles, that's all in the plot. Flip side is give that plot to 10 different guys, it'll come out looking 10 different ways. Sal took whatever I gave him, he responded to it, he understood it, and he always brought it up to another level, and we just hit it off. And it also helps, turns out he's one of the nicest people you're ever going to meet on the face of the earth. He was a true, something I would only, a word I only relate to generations before mine, because I can't think of anyone in my generation I'd apply it to. Sal was a gentleman. And is a gentleman, He's just a really nice, decent man and a great artist. And he was so devalued in those days. People have come around over the years and they finally realize you're not going to find a better storyteller, just in terms of his ability to visually tell a story. Because even if I'm giving you every panel, every page, every movement in that panel, the artist has to sit and decide how to portray that and where the hand is and where the face is and how that leads to the next panel. Visual storytelling is a very complex thing. No matter how detailed the script is, you can find an artist to either ruin that or raise it up. And Sal always raised it up. He knows how to do that. And he can really draw. And he can do the big action. And he can do what was so important to our story, the quiet emotional beats. He could do it all. This is a guy who had been, by that point, had been in the business for decades, and still every week went and did a drawing class. And it showed. And he was hitting a peak there. Something happened when we worked together. I think it's he's done a lot of great work. I think that two years on spec was some of the best work he's ever done. And Sal is always at his best when he inked himself.
Right.
And he inked himself that whole run. Fantastic stuff. I remember we did that 3-part Vulture story.
Yes.
And I remember he had a little extra time and he took the inking just to a whole other level, but through the whole run, just phenomenal work. And we just clicked, and you can't make that happen. Just same thing. Keith and I, maybe we wouldn't have clicked and it would have been the end of it, but happily we did. And Sal and I clicked. And I've been lucky over the years to work with a lot of great artists and have that chemistry with a lot of great artists. But I've seen situations where the art is really good, the writing is really good, you put it together and it just doesn't happen because some chemical reaction just doesn't occur. With Sal, it was like, it was great.
It was definitely a chemical reaction. It was an explosion.
Heck yeah.
And comics are words and pictures, and I don't care how brilliant my script is, if you don't have the right artist to bring it to life, it's just not going to happen. So you can't separate the two. You just can't separate the writing and the art.
The other question I had about that particular run is there's such a cadence to it, right? And the cadence is highlighted by one particular issue, and that's the leapfrog issue, which is like
Frogman.
the perfect you get through that child within, you get through that big storyline, you're emotionally drained, and then bam, you hit it with the comedy. You give us Walrus and White Rabbit and the Leapfrog and this wonderful tale about a father and a son that comes together to beat the bad guys. And I remember being 13 and feeling emotionally drained after reading 7 issues of Harry and Peter, who were best friends, and they're basically having their divorce on page. And then you give me Leapfrog. I could have wrote a letter and thanked you and said, like, that's what I needed at that exact moment. I needed it. I needed
it as the writer too. You know what I mean? I just written 7 really emotionally intense issues, about some very, very intense psychological issues running through all these characters. So I needed a breath. The audience needed a breath. And I always, the Frogman character I introduced in when I was doing Marvel Team Up years before, and I always loved it. He's the son of the Leapfrog, and he's trying to redeem his father's name. And he's just a dumb 15-year-old kid, and I love that character. I would write a Frogman miniseries tomorrow if I could.
Hey, Marvel. Get this guy on the horn, because I would buy it. I would buy it in the
okay, we've sold one to you and one to me.
There we go.
But you have to change it up. You have to change it up. And I had a lot of fun with that issue. And that was also sort of my paying tribute to Keith and Andy and our whole Justice League run as well. There were little Justice League breadcrumbs throughout. There's a Bwah-Ha-Ha in there. There's a little side comment where you realize it's referring to Oberon somewhere. There are little things like that scattered throughout the story.
So that brings us to your current work right now. Again, one of the reasons I asked you, not only an opportunity to get you finally on the Last Comic Shop, but you have this wonderful book out right now, Shadow of the Green Goblin. Again, I mentioned it on social media. Finally, we've got JM back writing Spider-Man and Green Goblin. And again, I picked up the first 2 issues. It's a story that's happening even before Peter meets Gwen and Harry, and you're adding.
It's just a few weeks after Uncle Ben died. Yeah.
You're adding so much layers. And I wanted to talk real quickly about issue 2. There's a great little segment in there where Spider-Man and Sandman are fighting, and they're both like, we've got these weird powers. We're strange. They don't know how to deal with it. And they just decide to go like, all right, time out. We can't talk to anybody else. We'll talk to each other. And I want to know, like, where did that come from? Because it was like, again, I'm like, JM is still revolutionizing some of these characters and some of these moments and some of these interactions with people. I want to know, like, where did that come from? Like, what?
You just follow the characters, and in this series, as I said, it's maybe 3 weeks at most, a month. I don't think it's even a month after Uncle. Time in comics, who knows what it is? But it's very, very early. It's somewhere between 2 weeks and a month after Uncle Ben has died. He doesn't know what the hell he's doing. He's 15 years old. If I was 15 years old and I had these powers, okay, I have power. So if I punch somebody, how do I know how to adjust my punch so I don't kill that guy? And that's one of the things. He's terrified of hurting somebody. He doesn't really know what he's doing. How do you? I'm a hero. How do you be a hero? And I realized it's the same thing for someone like Sandman. Oh, great. This weird thing happened and I turned into this giant sand being. You don't suddenly just become the Sandman overnight and walk around going, I'm going to rob banks and be the Sandman. It's got to screw you up. So I just wanted to play with the fact that both of them are in a similar state. It's so early. It's scary for them. And they've really realized that they found in this, quote, enemy someone they can finally talk to. And I really am very happy with that sequence where they just say, stop, let's go sit on the roof and chat for a little while. We can fight again tomorrow. Yeah. I'll meet you at that. I'm going to rob this bank tomorrow. I'll meet you there at 3:00 and we can fight some more. But for now, I promise I'm not going to do anything bad tonight. Let's have a chat,
And the amazing thing was that I don't think that interaction could have worked with a lot of other Spider-Man rogues. But you pick Sandman, who's like, not only, he's like a salt of the earth. He's a common man. He's
a regular guy like Peter. He sits
down with Thing and they share beers. Like that issue with the Thing where they share beers and they're just 2 regular Joes at a bar. Like that. That's why he can connect with Sandman. Yes. He's just another kid from New York that dude, lots of weird things are happening to me. I just want to talk.
Yes, exactly. It couldn't happen with Dr. Octopus. They wouldn't be sitting on that roof having that chat.
The research that you put into this one, you can tell you went through into the history, even pulling out the Proto-Goblin from what was that?
Credit where credit's due. My when we were discussing the series, and I said I wanted to set it early in Spider-Man's career, Danny Chasm, who's my editor, said, "Oh, we can use the Proto-Goblin." And I was like, "Who?" So I read the issue. I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, that'll work." Because we wanted to explore the Osborn family, and this is the perfect door in to Norman and Harry and Emily and all this stuff. So I didn't even know who the Proto-Goblin was.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, you're doing really well with them so far.
Well, that's the job, right? I always say you got to cut off the top of these guys' heads. You get out your flashlight, you root around, and you look for all the interesting things going on inside their heads. And that's how you make a story. You don't make a story from the plot in, you make a story from the characters out. And the other thing I'm enjoying with this particular story is, and I've done this with it kind of goes back to Moonshadow. This is Peter years later. That's the narrative. I love that narrative hook. It's years later. In my mind, he hasn't been Spider-Man for years. He's older, and he's looking back on this era in his life. And so when you're looking back on your life, you have a very different perspective. If I was telling that story in real time, from Peter's perspective when he was 15, it's a totally different story. Yeah. Having an older Peter looking back where you can understand humanity and motivations and look with a little bit of humor also changes the whole tone of the story.
He can reflect that he's pretending to be strong. That was the one note I had. You have characters pretending to be strong, and at that point in their lives, that's what it is because they don't know what the heck they're doing.
Right. Yeah. Right. He's faking it.
Plus, it pulls you in from a narrative perspective. I know that when I was reading those, we kind of sort of know as fans. We know what happened with Peter Parker or whatever, and some of us have been along for the ride for a really long time. So he's kind of like, I'm going to tell you a story about what happened one time that you may not know about. And we're like, oh, okay. And so we feel like we're sitting around that campfire with Peter as he's reminiscing about a time in his life that we didn't get a window into, which I just thought was like fascinating. Because you could have just started it with just, this is the story and whatever, but no, that narrative framing around it being like a tale that Peter is specifically telling you as an older gentleman. Great stuff. Great stuff.
Thank you. One of the choices for me that I think is one of the single most important choices you make as a writer is, what's the point of view going to be in that story? You can have the same story told from like a dozen different points of view. And sometimes I have a story that I've lived with for years and years and years and years and years, and I finally sell it and I sit down to write it. And I'm stuck because I don't really know what perspective the story is being told from, and that's such an important part of how you're going to enter the story, because that's the voice that leads you through, whether it's an omniscient narrator, whether it's Peter when he's 15. I could have had, Aunt May narrating that whole story, whichever Dorian you choose changes the whole story.
Okay. We could ask Spider-Man questions forever. I didn't even talk about Spider-Man 400. But we recognize that you have other things to do, including, but not limited to, DeMultiverse.
So I'd been thinking about doing a Kickstarter for a long time, but frankly, it intimidated me and it looked like a lot of work. And guess what? It's intimidating. It's a lot of work. But luckily, my friend David Baldy, who is a writer and a TV producer and also a very shrewd businessman, came to me and said, I'll work with it on you. And we started talking. He said, well, tell me some ideas that you have. And I pitched him a bunch of four different ideas. And he said, well, let's do them all. Let's do 4 number ones. We'll get 4 different artists, 4 different genres, get it out there. So that's what we did with the Kickstarter. We called it the DeMultiverse. It was very successful. We got all those first issues out. We are almost done now with all the second issues. In July, we will be launching phase 2 of the DeMultiverse, the second issues of all 4 of the books. We have Godsend, which is kind of a Jack Kirby meets the Matrix kind of cosmic tale. We have Wisdom, which is supernatural Western. We have Anyman, which is the closest to a traditional superhero story, but with a little twist thrown in there. And then we have Layla in the Lands of After, which is sort of an all ages fantasy adventure in the afterlife. Very, very different. Great, incredible bunch of artists. What we did the first time and we want to do this time is make sure these books are done by the time this Kickstarter wraps, because we don't want people sitting around. I've heard stories of people waiting like years for their books to show up after they support a Kickstarter.
Right.
So we if we wrapped the last Kickstarter, I think it was in November, people had all their books by the spring, and we want to do the same thing this time. So if anyone out there, if you enjoy the work, if you've enjoyed my work, please, the great thing about Kickstarter is there's a wall between creator and audience that's gone. That publisher, you know what I mean? That the traditional, you have to go through all these tunnels to get to the audience. Now it's just the creators and the audience. And David has created a little imprint for us called Spellbound Comics. If you go to spellboundcomics.com, you can find the first issues are still available there. So come along for that ride. It's one of the most exciting projects I've ever been involved in, actually.
And because you're going into the second Kickstarter, what did you learn in that first Kickstarter that you're applying to this? Like, looking back, I wish I had known that.
Well, here's one of the things, and someone told me this, but I didn't get it until it was really over. Because the most difficult thing is you have to be shamelessly hawking this thing for 30 days. It is not in my nature to wave that flag, but you have to, and you have to go on social media. You're all going to be all embarrassed about it, and you think you're just overdoing it, and the Kickstarter will be over, and someone's going to walk up to you and say, "I didn't know you had a Kickstarter." You have to, unfortunately, be shameless, because as I learned, you go on social media. I go on Blue Sky or Twitter or whatever at noon, and I put out a tweet about the Kickstarter. Well, by 12:15, there's thousands of different people on there that have never seen that. So, and it's a difficult thing. It takes a lot of time and attention, and you have to put your shame aside and just flog and beat the drum and do it in a respectful way, in a way that you hope will interest and excite people. But you have to hype, and you have to hype for 30 days in order to get people to come along. Now, happily, we have a group of people that supported us the first time that we hope most of them will come along for the second ride, but then you want to build on that. And hopefully we will do that. So that's coming up in July. Also in July is the first issue of my Batman project, Robin Lives, which, if you guys know about that one, it's the classic death of Jason Todd story, but this is like, what if Jason had lived? So Rick Leonardi's doing the art. I'm almost done with it. I just finished the third issue. It comes out in July. I haven't written Batman in a few years. It's really fun to be back working with Batman. And it's another one of those stories because it's basically dealing with terrible trauma, where it's all about what's going on inside these characters. It's a psychological journey for Jason and for Bruce, and it's and plus we get to play with a lot of different Batman villains in the course of the story too. So you get all the action, but a lot of really fun, meaty psychological drama going on in it too. So that's a lot of fun.
That's awesome. That's the other multiverse where that hotline turned out the other way.
That's right. And they did an issue where he lived, and that's the thing. And I think did they recently reprint that? I think
last year they put it out with the page with the option.
Right.
Had he lived.
So this takes off from there. But the great thing is that means I can do anything that I want, because we're not in the main continuity, So if at the end the Joker decides to become a dentist, which he doesn't, just to be clear, I can do that. I'm going to go to dental school and forget crime.
There's nothing wrong with that, though. I like that idea.
Would you really think about it? Would you want him to be your dentist? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, you could do this whole sort of, Sweeney Todd barber thing.
Right. He would be the Sweeney Todd of the dental world. That's very funny.
Sweeney Tooth.
So there's that. I've got some other projects in the work at Marvel that I can't talk about yet. I have an animation project that I'm doing now that I would love to tell you about, but I can't. It's very exciting. And the past few years, I've been back to prose. I've put out 2 novellas, one called The Excavator, one called The Witness. Both are available on Amazon. 2 of my favorite things that I've ever done. I'm at work on a third novella that I hope will be out by the end of the year. So busy, creative, life is good.
That's great. You're obviously all on the socials. Is there a main website where people can find you?
jmdematteis.com. You can go there. I try to be as responsive as I possibly can. I really, I have enjoyed social media. So that's why it's been so sad to see kind of Twitter start to just fall apart. And the other ones have been good, but they haven't quite come back to where Twitter was, So suddenly, instead of having one, we all have to have 5 different social media accounts, to reach the same people. But I enjoy it because I just like I'm enjoying this conversation. When you say to me how much Moonshadow meant to you, I don't take that for granted. That means something to me, and when someone on social media says the same thing, I love those interactions. Social media has a bad rap, but I've had primarily, I'd say 90% of my interactions with people over the years have been really, really positive and really, really good. So I enjoy that. So yeah, I'm out there. And believe me, once July comes, I'll really be out there with this thing.
All right. Well,
with the multiverse.
Make sure you jump on that Kickstarter. We've been talking to J.M. DeMatteis for this last hour, and we thank you for joining us here at the Last Comic Shop, and wish your Kickstarter all the best, and we're sure that it's going to do blockbuster.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. It was a genuine pleasure.
Get that Batman book
sir.
with friend of the show, Rick Leonardi. Yeah, we interviewed him too. So that's going to be awesome. I'm all about that.
And then we're going to do the Joker. The Joker as a dentist will be the sequel series.
Yes.
There we go.
We need that.
I'm glad you mentioned The Witness. I'm partway through it, but it's harrowing. That's a very interesting story. It's by the guy who witnesses a plane crash and he sees all of that. It's interesting.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. Yeah. And then check out the other one too, The Excavator, if you have a chance.
I will do so.
The ebook, the last one, they all have illustrations. The first one has 10 beautiful painted illustrations by a wonderful Greek artist named Vasilis Gonzilis. The second one has 10 illustrations and a cover by J.H. Williams III.
J.H. Williams, yeah.
Beautiful work. And so you can get it in traditional book form, but the ebook is literally $1. So it's not a huge investment.
Wow. Yeah, snag that. And only $1?
Yep.
And I will point out to my fellow hosts that at the beginning of the show, you did mention the egg cream. I love egg creams.
Yeah, I haven't had an egg cream in years, but when I was a kid, and then we have to stop because I do have to go. The same candy store where I bought the comic books, you get an egg cream, and then they had a big container with long stick pretzels.
There you go.
So an egg cream and a stick pretzel and a comic book. What more did you need from life when you're 10 years old,
That is a childhood to die for. Five.
Although I have to say, all right, we can do this forever. You're very welcome, guys. Thank you.
All right, so that was our interview with J.M. DeMatteis, and he's got a lot of awesome projects out there, and we hope that you're checking out all of them. And we're also hoping that you check out The Last Comic Shop in future, and you can do that by going out to www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com and getting all of these awesome episodes that we've got with interviews, including this week's, as well as other past folks. Just this year, we did Paul Cornell and Kyle Starks and a whole myriad of other things. So make sure that you're checking out our episodes as well as all of J.M. DeMatteis' work. Chad, where can you find some of that stuff?
So currently, you can find those things at your local comic shop, where you might look for things like Shadow of the Green Goblin. Or maybe you want to go on to the interwebs and join the DeMultiverse and find some of those wonderful Kickstarters he's got going on. Or maybe you want to go to your local bookstore and look for the novellas like Witness or Excavator. And then circle back to your comic shop to find all the other books that we were talking about and the other books that we didn't get a chance to talk about. There's so many wonderful things out there from J.M. DeMatteis. And all that waits for you at your local comic shop. And then circle back again to www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com, where they can find what else, J.A.?
Well, they can find links to our merch store where you can get coffee mugs, tote bags to carry all those books you're buying, and t-shirts. It's the summer. The summer special shirt is online. Get it in a nice, cool color, in a tank top maybe. Wear it to the beach. We also sell one with beautiful art by Mr. Mikey Wood. Once you're done buying all of that merch, head on back to the website and see what else we got going on. We got loads of stuff that is evergreen. All of our episodes, whether they be interviews or just reviews of comic books, either present or in the past. We've viewed Kraven's Last Hunt. We've reviewed some other J.M. DeMatteis.
Absolutely. Plus, if you need something to put all of those J.M. DeMatteis comic books in, Mikey's got a great code for you, right, Mikey?
Yes, we do. And it is from BCW Supplies. And the code is LCSPOD. That's for Last Comic Shop Podcast. So LCSPOD. Get yourself a discount on wonderful comic book safety boxes. What?
Safety boxes?
Paraphernalia.
No, you know what? From now on, I'm not going to call them long boxes anymore. I'm going to call them safety boxes. I'm going to walk into shops and be like, I don't cut myself.
Well, they do have those. They do also have those really like the high quality ones.
They do.
Yeah, the plastic ones.
The plastic ones, which I haven't ventured into, but they really do make the best boxes.
Yeah, self-sealing bags, bcwsupplies.com. They've got the best stuff. LCSPOD, get yourself 10%. And make sure that you're coming back to the Last Comic Shop next week. Until then, I was the host of The Most, Andy Larson. I was joined by Chad Smith, J.A. Scott, and the beautiful Mikey Wood. He's gorgeous.
Gorgeous.
Mwah! And remember to stay safe, stay cool, and try to find yourself an egg cream. I think you mentioned
Thank
it
you.
briefly. Yeah,
Ice cream. It's just an ice cream soda without the ice cream.
It's a chocolate milk with seltzer water. It sounds goofy, but you should have it.
They're great.
So good.
The Last Comic Shop podcast was a 2024 Black Angus production.